Welcome to episode 4 of the Python Basics series. In this video, we'll learn how to store multiple pieces of data in a single place, making use of collections like lists and dictionaries. So currently, we only know about basic data types in Python like strings, integers, floats, and booleans. However, the problem with these data types is that they can only store one value at a time. So this means if we wanted to store multiple pieces of information, then we need multiple variables to store all that data. However, there are also times when we need to store a collection of values, multiple values of information, instead of just one specific value. A real-world scenario which demonstrates this problem is storing the names of all the students who are in a specific class. With just strings, we'd need separate variables for each of the students' names. However, if we had something that served as a collection, we could save all of the students' names inside one list. So to solve these kinds of problems, we need a collection that can store multiple pieces of data that can be accessed from the same origin or the same source. Now, the first way of storing a collection of items that we're going to go over in this video is called lists. So for a real-world analogy, they're essentially large containers, and because these containers are large, they're big enough to hold multiple items inside. So in Python, this means lists can hold multiple values or pieces of data. So in order to create a list in Python, we can create a variable the same way as before, except after the equal sign, when we're providing the variable with its value, we use square brackets, and then inside those square brackets, we put the values that we want the list to contain, each of which are separated by commas. And you can have as many items inside the list as you want. So as an example, let's say we wanted to create a list with the names of all the students in a specific class. So we can call the list student names and then say equals to create the variable, and then create square brackets. And then here, inside these square brackets, we can provide the names of the people in the class. So, as an example, we could say Bob in quotes, and then a comma to go to the next name, and then John as the second person in the class, and then finally Phil as the third student. And now if we were to print out these student names, you can see all of them are printed out in the console like this. Now let's learn how to access the items inside a list. So in order to find the item in a list at index n, then you can make use of the square bracket syntax again, but this time type the name of the list, the variable name, and then immediately after that put square brackets and then the index inside those square brackets. However, an important thing to note is that the first item in the list is not at index 1, it's at index 0. And the index can also be negative, so an index of negative n means you're accessing the nth last item. So for example, if the index was -1, then that means I'd be picking the last item in the list, the item at the very end or the very right. And so if the index is out of bounds, then an error will pop up in the console. So make sure that before you access a specific item in the list, you make sure the index is not out of bounds. So let's go back to the student names example. So if I were to try to get the first student's name, then I would put 0 inside the square brackets here. And I put the square brackets immediately after student name so that it gets the item from student names. And so if I were to run the Python file, you can see the first name Bob is printed out. And so if I were to do 1 instead, then the second name is printed out, John. And 2, the third name, Phil. However, if I were to do 3, then that would access the fourth item in the list. However, there are only 3 items in the list, so that means it'll produce an error, an index error. So I can also access it from the end, access items from the end. So -1 will get the last item, -2 will get the second last, and -3 the third last. And -4, you've gone too far because there aren't any more than 3 items in this list. So the fourth last item doesn't actually exist. Next, let's go over some basic methods to manipulate lists. So let's say we wanted to add an item to this list, add a name to this list of student names. So the way we can do that is by writing the name of the list, student underscore names, and then add a dot to access the list's methods. And in order to add a name to this list of student names, we can make use of the append method. And then we can append an additional name to the list. So in this case, I'm going to go with Mitchell. And now if I were to print out the student names after I appended Mitchell to the end, you can see there are now 4 names. The 3 original names, Bob, John, and Phil, and Mitchell, which we added with the .append method. However, let's say we wanted to remove an item from this list. Instead of the .append method, we can use the .remove method. And then here you can see it says remove first occurrence of value. So let's say we wanted to remove John from the class. So we could just say John inside called the remove method. And now when we run this file, you can see John is gone and we just have Bob and Phil. If there are multiple Johns in the list, it'll just remove the first occurrence of John. So this is the first instance of John in the list because we're going from left to right. So it just removes this John right here, not the one at the end. We can also get the number of items in the list by typing in len, and then the name of the list. And this will give the amount of items, the number of items that are in this list. So in this case, it'll print out the number of names we have saved in this list if we were to print it out. And there are 3 names here, so it prints out 3 when we run it. We can also just replace a name in the list by using the same index notation that we looked at before, but this time setting it equal to a different value. So this means we're setting index 1, or the second name, to Mitchell. We're replacing John with Mitchell, so you can see it gets updated. However, if we were to do an index that's out of bounds, then it gives us that same error as before. Next, let's go to another type of collection called a dictionary. So dictionaries are similar to lists in the sense that you can consider them a large container with multiple items, except instead of accessing each item with an index, you access each item with a label which is formerly known as a key. And so the syntax for creating a dictionary is similar to a list, but instead of square brackets, you have curly braces. And before each value, you type in the name of a key to uniquely identify it in quotes, so it's a string, and then a colon after it, and then the value comes. So it's very similar, but it's also different in some ways. So let's say I wanted to create a user, information for a user by making use of a dictionary. So I could name this dictionary user or profile, and then use the curly braces, and then press enter to open it up like this. And then firstly in a profile, you'd probably want your name. So the first key could be name, and then the value will be, let's continue with Bob from before. And then the next key is age, and its value is 11. And then we can create another key if we wanted to, maybe favorite food. And then for that, we can say ice cream. We can also print it out by saying print and the name of the dictionary, profile. And then you'll see it prints it out like this in a similar way to what we wrote here. And we can also access specific parts of the profile. And then if we type in the curly braces, or the square brackets, sorry, to access specific parts of the profile, you can see the key names that we wrote up here. So if we wanted to get the name, then you can see it prints out Bob, and then age, 11, favorite food, ice cream. So what if we want to edit this profile? So maybe Bob's favorite food isn't ice cream anymore, and maybe he likes burgers now. So we can say profile, and then access favorite food via the square brackets, and then set it equal to burger. And then if we run the Python code, you can see his favorite food gets updated. We can also add new entries to the profile using this method as well. So let's say we wanted to include his best friend, and then let's say his best friend is Sarah. So now if we run the code, you can see a new entry gets created in the profile, best friend, and it's set to Sarah, which is what we provided here. These dictionaries are actually commonly used in the real world to store profile information like how we did in that example from before, and also additional information like, for example, in a coding platform, maybe a project, or information about a conversation in ChatGPT. So dictionaries have a lot of real-world uses along with lists. Before finishing this video, let's look at some other types of collections that are available in Python. So firstly, there are tuples, which are basically the same as lists, except you can't modify the items within it. Or in other words, it's commonly referred to as an immutable list because the items cannot be changed. And it's created in the same way as lists, but with parentheses instead of square brackets. And sets are also similar to lists, except they're created with curly braces instead of square brackets. So they're kind of like dictionaries, except they're also accessed through indexes and not keys. And they're basically lists where every item must be unique. So in other words, there can't be any duplicate values inside a set. So here you can see in the student names tuple, I've replaced the square brackets with parentheses. And notice how when we type in student names and try to access its methods by typing in a period, the add and remove methods are gone. So this shows how tuples cannot really be changed. However, you can still access items in tuples through indexes, but if you try to actually change the items in a tuple, then it'll give you a type error because a tuple is unchangeable. If we change the tuple to a set by putting curly braces around the values instead, then if we run it, you can see the items are printed out, but not in the order in which we gave them. So here it's Bob, John, Phil, but when printed out, it's Phil, John, Bob. So because of this characteristic of sets that they're unordered, we also cannot access the student names by an index. However, we can still modify the student names by adding items to a set, which you can do with the .add method, or the .remove method to remove an element from a set. However, if it's not present, it'll give an error. So let's cap off this video with an exercise to show what we've learned. So this involves a dictionary. So more specifically in this exercise, you're going to create a menu for a restaurant where the keys in the dictionary are the names of the items and the values are those prices of those items. So in this exercise, you need to add at least one item to the dictionary, change the price of at least one menu item, and then print out the price of at least one menu item. So that way, we're creating, accessing, and modifying the dictionary. We're getting practice in all three of those areas. However, this concludes episode 4 of Python Basics. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and be on the lookout for episode number 5.